For years. For whole years I'd been married to Craig, watching him live his pathetic, predictable life like some kind of robot programmed for maximum boredom. Every single morning at exactly 7:15, he'd shuffle to the kitchen in those ridiculous plaid pajama pants his mother bought him. Make his coffee with the precision of a chemist, then spend 20 minutes checking the weather app like he was planning an Arctic expedition instead of driving 15 minutes to his soul-crushing insurance job. The man actually counted his pens before putting them in his briefcase. Who does that? Meanwhile, I'm getting ready for actual important work, dealing with real deadlines and intelligent colleagues who understand that life is supposed to have some excitement, some spontaneity. I deserved better than this mind-numbing routine. I deserved conversations that didn't revolve around deductibles and premium adjustments. I deserved someone who could surprise me, who could make me laugh without it being some dad joke about actuarial tables. Craig was a good man, I suppose, in that boring, reliable way that makes you want to scream into a pillow. He paid the bills on time, never forgot to take out the trash, and treated me well enough. But Jesus Christ, the man had the personality of lukewarm oatmeal. That's probably why I didn't feel particularly guilty when Andrew started flirting with me at work. Andrew was everything Craig wasn't. Spontaneous, funny, unpredictable. He had this way of making even mundane office conversations feel electric, like we were sharing some delicious secret. When he complimented my presentations or made jokes about our incompetent manager, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. Craig would come home and ask about my day with that same polite interest he showed everything, like he was checking items off his good husband list. While Andrew actually listened, actually engaged, actually made me feel like I was worth paying attention to. The work-from-home arrangement made everything easier. Craig would leave for his office at exactly 8:30, return at exactly 6:15, and never deviate from his schedule unless the building was literally on fire. It gave me freedom I hadn't realized I was craving. When Andrew mentioned he was working remotely too, it felt like the universe was giving me permission to explore something that had been building between us for weeks. I told myself it didn't mean anything. It was just conversation at first, then coffee meetings that ran longer than they should have. Andrew claimed he didn't even know I was married initially, which made sense since I didn't wear my ring to work much anyway. It was always catching on things and getting in the way. When our coffee meetings turned into longer lunch breaks and then afternoon visits to my house, I convinced myself it was just harmless fun. Craig and I hadn't had sex in months anyway, too caught up in our respective routines to even notice we'd become roommates rather than lovers. The thing about affairs is that they escalate so gradually. You don't realize how far you've gone until you're already there. I knew it was crossing a line, but honestly, what Craig didn't know wouldn't hurt him. Besides, it was my house too, wasn't it? I had every right to have friends over. And if those friends happened to make me feel desired and interesting and alive, well, that was just a bonus. The Tuesday it all fell apart started like any other. Craig left at his usual time with his usual routine, mentioning something about a big client meeting that would probably run late. I had the whole day stretched out in front of me. When Andrew texted asking if he could come by around noon, I didn't hesitate to say yes. We'd done this dance several times now, and I'd gotten comfortable with the rhythm of it. Craig was predictable to a fault. If he said he'd be home at 6:15, he'd be home at 6:15, probably after stopping at the grocery store because Tuesday was grocery day in Craig's rigidly organized world. Andrew arrived right on time, bringing coffee and that easy smile that made everything feel effortless. We talked about work for a while, laughed about our boss's latest incompetent decision, and gradually the conversation shifted to more personal things. He had this way of making me feel like the most fascinating woman in the world, asking questions about my dreams and ambitions that Craig had stopped asking years ago. When he reached over to brush a strand of hair from my face, it felt natural. Inevitable. I led him to the bedroom without really thinking about it. This was my space, my time, my choice. Craig would never know. And even if he somehow found out, it wasn't like our marriage was some great passionate love affair anyway. We were so caught up in each other that neither of us heard the front door open. The first sign something was wrong was Craig's voice calling my name from downstairs, confusion evident in his tone. My blood turned to ice. He wasn't supposed to be home for hours. This wasn't part of his routine. Andrew scrambled for his clothes while I threw on a robe, my mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe I could say Andrew had stopped by to discuss a work project. maybe I could claim I wasn't feeling well. But when Craig appeared in the bedroom doorway, taking in Andrew's half-dressed state and my obvious panic, I knew there was no explanation that would make this look innocent. Craig just stood there for a moment. I could see him processing what he was seeing, that methodical mind of his working through the evidence like he was calculating an insurance claim. When he finally spoke, his voice was eerily calm. "I'd like you to explain what's going on here." The reasonable tone somehow made it worse. I'd expected yelling, accusations, drama. Instead, I got Craig being Craig, measured, controlled, probably already planning his next move. It pissed me off, honestly. Even catching his wife in bed with another man, he couldn't manage to show some genuine emotion. "It didn't mean anything," I said quickly, the words tumbling out. "It was just a stupid mistake, Craig. You're blowing this completely out of proportion." Andrew was frantically pulling on his shirt, looking between Craig and me like he was trying to figure out the safest exit strategy. Craig's attention shifted to him, and I saw something flicker in my husband's expression that I'd never seen before. Something cold and calculating that made me suddenly aware of how much bigger Craig was than Andrew's skinny frame. "This is all just a misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand," I continued. "If you just let me explain properly, we can work this out like adults." But Craig wasn't listening to me anymore. He was staring at Andrew with that same methodical focus he brought to everything, and I realized he was probably recording this whole thing on his phone. That was so typical. Even in a crisis, Craig was thinking about documentation and evidence. The man couldn't have a genuine emotional response if his life depended on it. "You need to leave," Craig said to Andrew, his voice still unnaturally calm. "Now." Andrew looked at me like he expected me to defend him, to stand up to my boring husband and choose excitement over security. And honestly, part of me wanted to. Part of me was tired of Craig's passionless approach to everything, including his own marriage falling apart. But Andrew was already backing toward the door, clearly not interested in any confrontation that might interfere with his comfortable life. "This isn't over," I told Craig as Andrew pushed past him. "We need to talk about this properly when you're being rational." That's when Craig's composure finally cracked. "Rational," he repeated. "I come home early because the HVAC broke and find my wife fucking her coworker in our bedroom. And you want to talk about rational?" The profanity sounded wrong coming from Craig's mouth. He never swore, never raised his voice, never showed any passion about anything. It should have been satisfying to finally get a real reaction from him, but instead it just made me angrier. Where was this energy when our marriage was slowly dying of boredom? Where was this intensity when I was practically begging him to be more spontaneous, more interesting, more anything? Andrew had made it to the front door, but Craig followed, and I trailed behind them, suddenly worried about what my methodical husband might do when his precious routine was this thoroughly disrupted. "Look, man, I didn't know she was married," Andrew said, which was complete bullshit and we all knew it. "This doesn't have to be a big deal." Craig laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Doesn't have to be a big deal. You're fucking my wife in my house, and it doesn't have to be a big deal." "Craig, stop," I said, moving between them. "You're scaring him." "Good," Craig replied. And that's when Andrew made the stupidest decision of his life and swung at my husband. I'd never seen Craig fight before. In 4 years of marriage, I'd never seen him do anything more physical than move furniture. But when Andrew's fist connected with his jaw, something primal took over. Craig absorbed the hit like it was nothing, then responded with a punch that sent Andrew stumbling backward into our coffee table. "You're going to kill him," I screamed, watching Andrew try to scramble away. But Craig wasn't out of control the way I'd expected. He was methodical, even in violence, landing precise hits that dropped Andrew to the floor and then stopping when it was clear the fight was over. Andrew was conscious but clearly done, holding his ribs and making pathetic whimpering sounds that honestly disgusted me. This was the man I'd risked my marriage for, this coward who couldn't even defend himself properly. Craig stood over him, breathing hard, and I realized my husband wasn't the weak, boring man I'd convinced myself he was. He was controlled, disciplined, and apparently capable of serious violence when pushed too far. That's when my own control snapped. I launched myself at Craig, clawing at his face with my nails, trying to mark him the way he'd marked Andrew. "Get away from him," I shrieked. "Leave him alone." Craig caught my wrists easily, holding me at arm's length while I struggled against his grip. My nails had left bloody scratches across his cheek, and I felt a savage satisfaction at the sight. At least now he'd have some visible evidence of what his boring, passionless approach to life had cost us both. "Brittany, stop," he said, and the disappointment in his voice was somehow worse than anger would have been. "Just stop." But I couldn't stop. For years of frustration and resentment were pouring out of me, and Craig was the perfect target for all of it. "This is your fault," I screamed. "If you weren't so boring, so predictable, so completely fucking inadequate, none of this would have happened." Craig released my wrists and stepped back, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the police," he said calmly. "No." The word tore out of my throat. "Craig, please don't call the police. You're going to ruin my life over something that doesn't even matter." But he was already dialing, and I could see in his expression that my husband, the man I'd thought was too weak and boring to ever surprise me, had made a decision that would change everything. The police arrived faster than I'd expected, and suddenly my living room was full of uniformed officers asking questions and taking statements. Craig had his evidence ready: photos, recordings, witness statements from the neighbors who'd heard the commotion. Even in crisis, he was organized and thorough. It was infuriating and impressive at the same time. When they put handcuffs on me, I couldn't believe it was really happening. I was the victim here, wasn't I? Craig was the one who'd attacked Andrew, who'd refused to listen to reason, who'd escalated everything beyond any rational response. But apparently the scratches on Craig's face and Andrew's claim that I'd assaulted my husband were enough to make me a criminal in the eyes of the law. Andrew was arrested too, which gave me some small satisfaction. At least we were both suffering for this, both paying the price for Craig's vindictive overreaction. The next few days were a nightmare of lawyers and bail hearings and phone calls with my parents, who couldn't believe their daughter was being treated like a common criminal. My mother kept insisting that I couldn't possibly have hurt Craig, that he was obviously making things up to gain advantage in what would inevitably be a messy divorce. My father was ready to hire the most expensive attorney in the state. The fallout at work was almost worse than the legal consequences. Word had gotten out about the arrests, and HR launched an internal investigation that made every day at the office humiliating. Andrew resigned rather than face the scrutiny, which left me to deal with the gossip alone. They moved me to a different department and revoked my work-from-home privileges, effectively punishing me for being the victim of Craig's vindictive campaign. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Craig had decided to go all out, refusing every attempt at reasonable settlement and demanding terms that would leave me with almost nothing. His lawyer painted me as a manipulative adulteress who'd betrayed her husband's trust and then physically attacked him when confronted. Craig wasn't interested in amicable. He wanted total victory, and he had the evidence to get it. The restraining order was the final insult. Craig claimed he feared for his safety, pointing to the scratches on his face and my unpredictable behavior. It meant I couldn't go back to the house, couldn't retrieve most of my belongings without police supervision, couldn't even contact him directly. Everything had to go through lawyers, which made every conversation expensive and adversarial. Months later, sitting in my cramped apartment and preparing for yet another court date, I still couldn't quite believe how completely my life had been destroyed by one moment of bad timing. If Craig had stuck to his routine, if the HVAC hadn't broken, if he'd just been the predictable, boring man I'd married, none of this would have happened. Andrew and I would have had our fun and probably gotten bored with each other eventually, and life would have gone back to normal. Instead, I was facing criminal charges that could affect my career permanently, divorce terms that would leave me financially devastated, and a social stigma that followed me everywhere. Craig had surprised me in the worst possible way. The boring, predictable husband I'd thought I could manipulate and control had turned out to be methodical and strategic in his revenge. He documented everything, planned his legal strategy carefully, and executed it with the same attention to detail he brought to his insurance work. I'd underestimated him completely. And now I was paying for that mistake with everything I'd built over 4 years of marriage. The criminal charges were still pending, hanging over my head like a sword. Andrew had been released on bail but was facing assault charges that could seriously impact his future employment. We weren't allowed to contact each other, which was probably for the best since I blamed him almost as much as I blamed Craig. My parents kept insisting that Craig was a monster, that no reasonable man would destroy his wife's life over one mistake. They couldn't understand why I'd married someone so vindictive, so cold, so willing to use the legal system as a weapon. But they hadn't lived with Craig for 4 years. They hadn't seen how methodical he was about everything, how he planned and organized and controlled every aspect of his environment. I should have known he'd approach the destruction of our marriage with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything else. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd cheated because Craig was too boring and predictable, only to discover that those same qualities made him a formidable enemy when betrayed. The man who couldn't surprise me with a spontaneous dinner date had managed to completely upend my life with his calculated response to my infidelity. He'd turned my moment of passion into a legal and financial catastrophe that would follow me for years. As I sat in my lawyer's office preparing for the next phase of our divorce proceedings, I couldn't help but wonder if this was what Craig had wanted all along. Not just to end our marriage, but to make sure I paid the maximum possible price for ending it the way I did. The boring, passionless husband I'd betrayed had turned out to be capable of a very passionate revenge, and he was executing it with ruthless efficiency. The settlement offers kept getting worse, not better. Craig's lawyer made it clear that my husband had no interest in alimony, no willingness to split assets equitably, and no desire to make the process easier for anyone. He wanted total victory, complete vindication, and the legal destruction of the woman who'd betrayed his trust. The methodical man I'd lived with for 4 years was applying that same systematic approach to making sure I regretted every moment I'd spent in Andrew's arms.